everybody. This is Steve Falcon Napier. Welcome to the Circle of Brilliance. Today we're going to have a discussion about a book that was published about 10 years or so ago called The American Nations. And it was about by Colin Woodard. And it was about how the United States came to be explored, colonized, ultimately grew into the country that it's grown into today. And basically what Woodard does is he identifies 11 different nations that North America could be divided into. So obviously, while we're looking at primarily the United States, this also incorporates all of Canada and at least northern Mexico. So anything that's properly considered North America. For those who don't know, those that are from joining us from other countries, one of the things that the United States is often criticized for is referring to itself as America. It is the United States of America, but America is actually both the northern and the southern continents of North and South America. And so people from Mexico have just as much right to call themselves as Americans as Canadians do, as people in Panama or Brazil or you name it. They're all technically from the Americas, and so they do that. But for whatever reason, probably because saying the United States of America is just too many syllables, somewhere along the line, we started to refer to ourselves as Americans. But there are technically these different 11 nations as Woodard has divided them up. And each one of them is interesting historically, it's interesting culturally, philosophically. And I think as we explore these, you start to understand a little bit about the different characteristics one encounters as you travel around the country, why there is the kinds of conflicts there are, etc. Now, I, of course, want to tie everything back to tension management. So I think a very interesting thing to look at is what was going on in the level of the tension in the people who originally came to the US and decided to colonize or explore whatever they decided to do. Some of them were conquerors and others were just here for practical business purposes, but they all had their own reasons for coming. And obviously those reasons are going to have some connection back to what their productive tension was all about. And so I thought that could be a fun thing to look at. So let me go ahead and just introduce you guys to these 11 different nations. Now on the screen, you should be seeing a very strange map of North America, mostly the US. And I'm going to text over to everybody the link to this particular website. Linda was able to find this. Apparently there's a company that does summaries of textbooks, and someone did the summary. If you read it, they really needed to have edited it. There's spelling mistakes, there's missing words, there's all kinds of things. But nevertheless, the gist of what we'd like to understand is here. You could also go to Wikipedia if you'd like to have a very simple paragraph or so describing what each of these 11 nations is really all about. If you've not read the book,
the one that was the easiest and most comprehensive in summarizing the book.
Yeah, because it goes through all kinds of very interesting sorts of things as we scroll through this. So I think if you guys go ahead and follow that link I just chatted over to everybody, you'll be able to perhaps see this a little bit more clearly than it's going to show up on the screen. Now, and those who have read the book, I think, Kathy, you said you've read the book. I know Linda has read the book. I'm kind of curious to know if the order that they've listed them in here is actually the order in which they were established. I do think the first few are certainly by order of establishment because number one, the First Nations, and by the way, the First Nations are up here at the top of the map. So this gray area you see up here, for the most part, the First Nations are all up in Canada. And Canada continues to refer to its Indigenous population as First Nations. So the First Nations or American natives who have always been here. So I don't know if we want to study the genetics of how they came to be in the northernmost parts of the Americas, but nevertheless, there they are. Now, read what they were all about. American natives, First Nations, worked well with the French in northern areas until broken promises and English beliefs about their own superiority soured them. So, in fact, as we start reading a little bit further down about New France, you'll get a little bit more of a glimpse into there. But point is, First Nations was here to begin with. Then number two, El Norte. These outposts of Spain's colonial empire consisted of independent-minded Spanish frontiersmen, ranchers coming up from Mexico. So certainly that population that now is in Mexico or historically came from Mexico, so Aztecs, Mayans, etc. It's almost like they're their own version of First Nations. They were there long before anybody else came along. But at a certain point in time, Spain came along as it spread its colonial spread. And they decided they were going to do what they were going to do. So now El Norte, if you look at it, again, those of you who aren't familiar with the actual map of the United States, this horizontal then goes diagonal line, that kind of line there, that is actually the border between the United States and Mexico. A lot of that border is defined by the Rio Grande River. Some of them are defined by just, lines, geopolitical lines. But a lot of El Norte spills into the United States. So southernmost California, southern Arizona, southern and eastern New Mexico would all be very strong. Oh, and look at here, the southernmost area of Texas, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. This is El Norte. And certainly, okay, we live in Arizona, in Phoenix. Well, pretty much right now I'm pointing to where that is. And so we very much live in kind of like a border area between El Norte and the far west. So when we talk a little bit about the cultural distinctions between those, you guys might better understand the mindset of people who live here. Okay, and then I think so. I wanted to start with those just to say, look, those were here and had been being developed for a long period of time. Well, then others started to arrive, and the first group that came along was New France. Now, New France is very much up in northeastern Canada, where it's primarily French speaking. So Montreal and Quebec and the province of Quebec and all that is all up there. And there's certain communities, even in Maine, in the US, where the primary language spoken is French. And so this was New France, but New France is also down here in Louisiana. Um, so the question became, well, why was that? Well, primarily it was because, here we go, expanding the French colonies, these fur trading explorers wanted to take care of the lands they settled in Canada and upper New England. They were explorers, not terribly ideological, who wanted to trade. They integrated peacefully with Native Americans and wanted to take care of the land. Well, that's a very different philosophy that you're going to be exposed to as time came along. And so now why down in Louisiana? I'm still not entirely sure how that came to be, but I would imagine that there was a lot of export possibilities because New Orleans is at the place where the Mississippi River enters the Gulf of Mexico. So this is very much a transportation hub, particularly transportation by river into the sea. And so it might very well have been that that was one of the principal routes that they used to move the furs down to the south where they could then ship it to wherever it needed to go. And who knows what other great goodies there are down in that particular area. Certainly there's lots of seafood and culture like that. Okay, thoughts about anything I've said so far? Please feel free to unmute and say something. Kathy, any thoughts?
Yeah,
Linda, any thoughts?
yeah. I mean, I think that it's accurate that these are listed in order of arrival. If
Yeah.
you want to put it that way. I generally agree with the text here on what's been said. I've read a couple of his books around this and studied this separately. So I think it's a fascinating topic. I think it's to me, it is the history of colonialism in North America. That's how I look at it. It's the history of colonialism and its impact on the current day culture the cultural, the cultural threads and impact on our fabric
Mhm.
in
Yep.
our country as well as in other countries in North America. But I think he's done a beautiful job of pulling that together and making it understandable, I
Mhm.
think.
I think so too. I think so too. Other thoughts before I ask the big question? Big question. What could that be? All right. See, for me, the real question is, what was the tension that they had? Now, if we look at the First Nations, and I would think, well, their primary tension was being left alone, because they probably were just going about their life when these people started to arrive. Well, the French came along first and basically um, had a really good working relationship. They had a place they could now sell more of the furs and make some money and probably get some things in exchange that came from overseas or whatever. For trade was really happening, and so that was a good thing. Because I see here it says that until broken promises and English beliefs about their own superiority soured them. So it seems like things were going just fine and dandy, and everyone was humming along somewhere on the change grid. Where do you think they were humming along on the change grid before whatever the fallout was started happening?
I think what happened was, because the First Nations still are the First Nations. They're the only group that still lives by their values and their traditions, and people kind of let them live their lives up there in Canada.
Yep.
But then the French came again, and when they settled that time, they decided that they were going to integrate with the Indians, marry, teach each other different things about how to grow this or how to do that. And they became a collective.
I would argue that's a little bit rosier than I mean, I agree, Linda. It's a little bit rosier because all of these colonists in some shape or fashion, because of the Catholic Church in the Catholic countries, all sought to convert the Indians and change their culture, which is why you have large swaths of peoples in Canada who are still relatively autonomous, and I mean, not that Canada is not racist as well, but they're autonomous, whereas in the United States most of these tribes were decimated along the way. The English really did the final blows.
Yeah.
But I think throughout, between the French were more collaborative than the Spanish were, and the Spanish were, just, but the Catholic Church played a real role in decimating the cultures of the Native Americans, I think, even among the French.
Yeah, and so it's interesting that if we just think about the French as a culture, independent of religion, they seem to have been getting along just fine. So both parties were getting something. So I think they were kind of like humming along here in power or whatever. And then I think what you've said is correct. The Catholic Church came along and wanted to start converting people and building all kinds of churches. And certainly that area of Canada is highly Catholic. And it certainly didn't start there. So somehow it got a stronghold. So that's really very interesting. So again, from a tension management perspective, they came along, they found a win-win situation between the First Nations and the French fur traders. They both respected the land. It all sounded very nice, and then some other factors came into play. And it sounds like that was the Catholic Church on the one side and the English British kind of influence on the other side. Yeah, I mean, at some point, Canada became a Commonwealth of Great Britain, still is. So, yeah. Okay. Now, if we look at El Norte, again, I kind of feel like I'm looking at the same thing, that prior to the Spanish colonial empire expansion sorts of efforts, it seemed like the people that were living in this area of the landmass were probably humming along just fine, doing whatever it is they had been doing, however they'd been doing it for who knows how long. And someone comes along and it's a disruptor. And initially that disruption is probably embraced because I'll bet the first thing that happens is trade begins, and the local population feels like, oh, we can make some extra money. We can, improve ourselves by doing that. And then they realize that these trading partners may very well have another agenda. And that agenda was obviously here spreading Spain's colonial empire. So again, I kind of feel like I'm looking at a situation where, from a tension management perspective, things were humming along just fine. Power apathy, right along there. An opportunity came and presented itself to trade with a new partner. So moved us up into power. There were now goals, a little bit more of an outgrid kind of behavior. So more engagement, all that good sort of stuff that can happen outgrid. And then things slowly but most definitely changed, and now it became more of an upgrade sort of a situation. And of course, there's all kinds of wars that followed, etc. Are you guys, from the tension management perspective, are you seeing what I'm describing? Do you agree with what I've described, or anything you want to add to that?
Well, if I can join in,
Please do.
especially, I always thought that, well, the war created the tension, but if you have more insight, then it looks like the ch- the that the outsiders wanted them to change, not particularly die.
Mhm. Right.
so
Mhm.
but this change originally created some tension, right, which
Mhm.
exploded into warfare.
Well, it started off as positive tension, if you want to
Yeah,
label it as such, because there was opportunity. And remember,
yeah,
power stress is all about seizing opportunities. Oh, this is great. Let's do this. This is wonderful. And at the beginning, because probably the number of people involved from the outside were quite small. You're talking about fur traders, not an entire army coming over. But then I think what comes into play is greed. And we talked about that. We're going over the 7 deadly sins. It's the greed when, um, I don't know, perhaps back in France, we've watched enough about the French aristocracy and French royalty and their behavior to know that they probably very much enjoyed the quality of Canadian furs and all the other things that came from Canada. I mean, I would imagine back at that point in time, even something like maple syrup was a delicacy from all around the world, and it's unique to that area of North America. So anyway, I think that it took time, but it was probably driven by greed. There was some sort of resource that the conquering party really wanted, really valued, and weren't willing to continue to give the people who had the items to trade a fair value, and so it was cheaper, faster, easier to conquer them. Um, Now, I don't really know enough about Canadian history to know if there was ever a war between Canada and anybody for that reason, or if they just kind of willingly at some point said, sure, we'll be part of the UK or whatever. But that happened after those indigenous people had already been there forever and then some. Kathy or Linda, anything you guys remember about?
Yeah, there were lots of wars. I mean, I think there were lots of wars throughout. I would argue that, again, I don't think it was ever really collaborative when the Spanish came, and basically
Mhm.
when they came to the Mayan and the Aztec
Absolutely.
civilizations, just came for the gold. You know, they came to destroy them, and so I mean, it really was never a. It might have been for a short period of time collaborative,
Right.
but from what I understand of the history, that was a purely exploitative kind of.
Yeah, I understand completely. And see, that's one of the things I wanted to get to is say, just like we're talking about these different nations have a different level of inherent tension, that is also, what do I say, a manifestation of the level of tension, or the tension profile of the culture behind it.
That's
And
right.
so if the culture is a culture who believed, for whatever reasons, that it was superior to everybody else on the planet, no doubt they would conquer. But I believe Spain probably had a whole bunch of explorers out and about before they started sending armies. But if those explorers found anything at all, and they had to make it look all nice and sweet at least, so the explorer could safely leave the landmass, then trouble followed. And it probably followed, relatively speaking, quite quickly. Quite quickly. So, all right, so let's take a look at a few of these other ones to see there's more dynamics that are going on. So we get it. In the South, they were after minerals because down there, Joseph, you wouldn't know this about the US, but down in that area of the country is also where copper mining was big business. So copper and gold and silver. There's, to this day, there are a lot of communities, even in southwestern United States, that carry the names of mines. So Silver City was all because it was a silver mine, and that mine is still in operation today. And copper was very big business in southern Arizona. And that, so they're after the minerals, and up north, probably very much after the furs. Okay, so now we get to Yankeedom. Things change a little bit here. Yankeedom, the founders wanted to create a puritanical fundamentalist utopia with mandated education, justice, and rights for all humans. They hated the English, and most wanted freedom of religion as long as it was their own. So, and a lot of the early days were Yankeedom expressing itself. So this whole New England region, all the way across to the west to include Michigan, and then you have Wisconsin and Minnesota and part of the Dakotas. So obviously these people started over here on the East Coast, but as they migrated further and further west, they took that culture along with them and ended up creating that. Um, so if you think about that, well, what was their motivation? It sounds like their motivation was to escape whatever persecution they felt they were under religiously in wherever they started from. And then they came here. Oh, and by the way, I was reading a history of this whole puritanical movement. A lot of it was facilitated by the Netherlands. So very interesting that it was a place that they could kind of use as a jumping base to go from wherever they were being persecuted through the Netherlands to where they could get passage to the New World. And that's so very tolerant initially, but they were all trying to come here in order to create this utopian sort of society, believing that the rights of all humans, etc.
So I highlighted something about Yankeedom because I was trying to figure out the differences and get a clear picture. So it says Yankees have the greatest faith in the potential of government to improve people's lives, tending to see it as an extension of the citizenry and a vital bulwark against the schemes of grasping aristocrats, corporations, and outside powers.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and so this is where you get the people who really believe that we have to work as a society. We have to, really make sure that everybody is okay. Everyone is factored in, and you'll find that's going to be reinforced when we get to the Midlands as well. But point is, they came here because the tension of where they were was too great. So they actually came here as a way to relieve their own tension. Um, Sadly, they were right behind them came the conquerors. And so that's when even those Yankees, you talk about the Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War was between the original settlers came to the U.S. and the English. So, yeah. All right. So now you get to
If
the,
I
yep,
can just comment one more
please
thing
do.
about Yankeedom, being a New Englander and living here and seeing the after effects of that philosophy is as oppressive as the puritanical system was. What they did leave and did create was a very highly functional city and town
Yes.
governance model
Yes.
that is very collaborative and very open. And I'm able to, as being in Connecticut, I'm able to participate in that quite easily. I'm able to participate very easily in government. And people in New England are very, very active in
Yes.
their governments. And that was one of the real benefits of that, of their escaping and wanting self-governance.
Yeah, because, while the Puritans were very strict, also up in that area, we found the Quakers and the Shakers and far, collective, far more, I want to say, wanting to work in a cohesive, collaborative kind of a way without all the kind of strictness that the Puritans kind of carried with them. And you're absolutely right. And look what it gave rise to. If we were to say, well, the top colleges and universities in the United States, with a couple of exceptions, are going to be up in that area. So not just because that's the oldest area of the country, but because that's also where the values were that led to those kinds of institutions even existing. Yep. Okay, so now that's Yankeedom. Now the next one was the New Netherlands. New Netherlands, you really can't even see it on the map because pretty much New Netherlands is New York, specifically New York around Manhattan, around the city of New York, and I'm sure it goes down into New Jersey, and so, but it's really a pretty tight kind of an area. And I particularly love New Netherlands. So New Netherlands, they were founded by Dutch explorers, Dutch traders, etc., who wanted to establish a trading relationship to trade furs and engage in shipping from a cosmopolitan meeting place. I love this. They did not care about English politics or slavery. They really didn't care to get involved in any of those kinds of agendas. They came here with a very clear intention, and that was to have a hub for trade and do whatever they could do to centralize and do that. Those of you who aren't all that familiar with the Netherlands, and Joseph obviously lives there, so he can be our resident authority. The Netherlands has always been the world traders. They, from long, long, long ago, realized that the best way for them to carve out a unique industry for themselves was to facilitate the trade from everybody else in the world, everywhere else it goes, and that continues to this day. So I went to a Dutch college, so I'm a little bit partial to the whole thing, but to this day, the thought is that the Dutch are really all about just getting along because war is very expensive. Not getting along with one another is very pricey and wasteful. If everybody can just find a way to get along, then trade can happen and everybody can benefit. And so I think that's why the Dutch have, in fact, when I first started doing business in the Netherlands, I said, okay, well, I guess I should learn to speak Dutch. And one of my Dutch clients said, don't even try. They said, there's a reason why the Dutch speak all these other languages. It's because no one's going to learn to speak Dutch. It's a difficult language. And, it's not exactly as widely spoken as so many other languages that you would need if you wanted to become world traders. So Joseph, is that a fair thing to have said?
Yeah, of course, it sounds good. I might like to add that there's not much natural resources in
Well,
this
right. Yeah.
small area, which originally was a swamp. So we had
Yeah,
no
yeah.
choice to make connections and to start trading. But
Right.
there were wars. There were wars, but I like what you say.
Yeah. Well, and I think to this day, one of the things that I found fascinating in my times in the Netherlands is what percentage of the world's flowers and soft fruit actually go through Amsterdam every single day. because that's where the big world auction houses are. That's the hub for moving these kinds of highly perishable product all over the world. And when Linda and I were in Panama, we had a neighbor, and the neighbor, his whole business, I mean, he was in his 80s by the time we got to know him, but he was from the Netherlands, and he's the one who created this giant company that did nothing but bring soft fruits like berries and things like that from all over the world. He brought it into the Netherlands, auctioned it all off, and within an hour's time, it was on another airplane traveling someplace else in the world, all having been auctioned off. So it was phenomenal to learn about the amount of trade that actually goes through the Schiphol airport on a daily basis, or Rotterdam, I'm sure, as well. So anyway, the world traders. So the Netherlands came along for a long time. New York was going to be New Netherlands. And if you've been to New York City, you know how many things have Dutch names and all that good sort of a thing. You also know that New Netherlands, in fact, let me scroll back to a different little chart here. I think this is what it said. Um, Established by the Dutch, New Netherlands has a global commercial culture, materialistic with a profound tolerance for ethnic and religious diversity, a center of publishing, trade, and finance, a magnet for immigrants, defends public institutions. So I think that resonates very much with our experience of, even traveling to New York. It is the melting pot of the world. Every culture is there. There is high levels of tolerance, if you will, for that sort of a thing. Still
I
not
would
as,
like
yeah.
I would like to add here, and the Dutch made a huge contribution to our government and to our Constitution, and that they really influenced the more humanistic
Mhm.
values, the Bill of Rights,
Yes.
that emerged. It was really Dutch thinking that that supported a lot of the open nature of the United States' Constitution and
Mhm.
Declaration of Independence and all of that. And so we have a lot to owe the Dutch from that standpoint. I'm a real fan of what they did for our history.
Very much, very much. But I kind of appreciate
Welcome.
just thank you. but the example for tolerance, and by the way, you don't need to spend a lot of time in the Netherlands to recognize that it has its own challenges. Certainly, it has its own cultural, I want to say, conflicts, even within different areas of the Netherlands. And so, while I think it's be the perfect place to live, every Dutch citizen I've ever said, "Oh yeah, I'd love to live in the Netherlands," their initial response is, "Why?" So it's like, I got my reasons. It's not the weather, I'll tell you that. So, anywho, okay. So while we're there, let's go back up to Yankeedom, because I think this paragraph says something here too. Yankeedom, Puritan founders valued the common good, education, and a broad citizenship or citizen participation in politics and government, more comfortable with government regulation and social projects than the other nations. Yep, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. New France, so the southernmost parts of Louisiana, along with southern Canada, blend French peasants and the native people the French encountered. Down-to-earth residents are tolerant and consensus-driven and accept government involvement in the economy. Okay, we can get along with that. Okay, so after New Netherlands, I think the next one is Midlands. Let me go down here. Yeah, the Midlands. Quaker William Penn. Oh, by the way, the Midlands surround Yankeedom. So it's up here in Canada. It's down here running through the northernmost Ohio. That looks like northern Pennsylvania, all the way west to, what is that, the middle of Nebraska. Yeah, and then up into the provinces of Ontario for the big part. What's immediately to the left of Ontario? Is that Manitoba? Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to look up the little map there. Anywho, maybe even a little bit of Quebec over here. So the Midlands. Quaker William Penn wanted a tolerant, isolated Quaker anti-slavery society. They loathed the Yankee religious theocracies. So there you go. People are already having issues with Yankeedom. They thought, let's just move a little bit away. Any direction will be fine. Let's just get away from that and become a little bit um, more common here. Let me scroll a little bit, tell you what else it says up here. So the Midlands, rooted in the traditions of English Quakers and German immigrants, this nation believes society should be organized to benefit ordinary people, prizes the middle class and pluralism, rejects both top-down government and strong ideology. This makes it a swing nation. So, and a lot of the swing states in elections tend to be right along there. Well, there's plenty of exceptions to what I just said, but nevertheless, that makes good sense. Now, again, going back to attention management perspective, if we look at New Netherlands, the Dutch were coming here because they were in power, up to power stress, saw an opportunity, thought, let's go out there, let's create some trade relationships. The Dutch are masters at making first contact, and when it comes to actually moving things along, as Joseph said, the country itself doesn't have any natural resources, so it has to create another foundation for its economy. So it has to be someone who would be very well trusted, very well regarded, that they were going to be clear in what they were saying, people of verbal contracts, written contracts, etc., but people of their word. And so that's what they came ready to do, and obviously already very skilled at creating those kinds of things. Now, again, that doesn't mean that everything the Dutch have ever been involved in trading is all noble and all that. I believe the Dutch were also very much involved in the slave trades. And so, you know, it's all still, nevertheless, they have this system, this mechanism through which different things could be bought and sold and moved for other people to buy and sell. And so there it all. So I think they came here because they saw opportunity and thought, hey, let's get there first, let's do it better, and let's see where it all leads to. Then I think by that point in time, there were a lot of people who were getting a little bit frustrated with the puritanical side of Yankeedom, and they decided to spread a little bit, you know, around from there to have that. But in many of the cases, the beliefs are very similar, just not quite as strong as they were. Kathy, is that correct? Linda, is that from what you guys read in the book? Is that?
Um, yeah, I think generally, yeah, you know, but the Quakers were so fundamentally different than the Puritans. The
Yeah.
Puritans were so stern and, you know, righteous and unbending, inflexible, and the Quakers are all about love and friendship, and
Yeah.
so there, you know, there was that difference, and but I can understand. I mean, you know, when I look at, I think your description makes sense, and the way it permeates different parts of the country is just really interesting.
Because what I thought was really interesting was, I mean, again, we'd have to look at the exact locations on the maps. And so, Joseph, for your benefit, this particular band here, the pink, that's also part of the Midlands. Well, in the United States, there are several pockets of strong Amish and Mennonite populations. And they tend to live a bit more isolated. Certainly the Amish live a more isolated lifestyle than the Mennonites do, but nevertheless, and they're kind of like, I think, in that more pinkish kind of an area. I'd have to really look at the exact map to know where's Lancaster, PA. Is it up there in Yankeedom, or is it a little bit down here in the Midlands? So these are populations that continue to live very traditionally. The Amish don't even allow electricity, so forget technology. They live a very I don't want to say primitive, because it's all calculated by choice, but a very simple traditional kind of lifestyle.
And there's a pocket of Amish in central Michigan as well.
Yeah, in Michigan, and I know there's plenty in Iowa if we go a little bit further west. we there. Now, as you travel further out there, now we start getting into Mormon country. Linda and I were quite surprised when we moved to Arizona to find out how large the Mormon population is in Arizona, but it's huge. Certainly nothing compared to Utah, but we're just south of Utah, so not it should be all that surprising. Okay, so I brought all that up just to say the Midlands probably had their level of tension more about being able to practice something that was not as strict as the Puritans were all about. So different levels of tension or different sources of tension move them elsewhere in the country. Because that's all I've always wondered, why am I moving? I'm either moving because I'm trying to either move towards something I want, or I'm moving because I'm trying to get away from something I don't want. And so, like, I think when the people who were at the beginnings for Yankeedom first came over, they were getting away from something they didn't want as their primary motivator. And their secondary motivator was the belief that once they got here, they could create what they really did want. So a little bit of both. And I wonder if the Midlands was really more driven by the opportunity to create something that they really, really wanted that they couldn't have where they were, or trying to get away from whatever it was they found oppressive from that.
I think on the East Coast, the Midlands includes, and I can't remember, includes the Maryland, which is a
Yep.
Catholic country, Catholic state. And so there was also Catholicism thrown into the mix of that, which was again discriminated against by the Puritans.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
so there was that whole notion of religious freedom of different, very different religions and very different ethnic groups in the Midlands kind of.
It's interesting that you brought that up because Linda and I have watched a couple of programs, not documentaries, just kind of interesting programs. Like, I don't know if you guys have seen Murdoch Mysteries. You seen the Murdoch Mysteries?
I once or twice.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's based in Toronto at the turn of the 20th century. And William Murdoch is the center character in the whole thing. He happens to be Catholic. And they refer to him as a papist, and he's very much discriminated against and all sorts of things. And this is Toronto 120 years ago. And I know that if we go into even New York City, there's a lot of issues because, am I right that pretty much the police department is Irish? Is that how it was? The Irish started the.
Well, yeah, the Irish founded the Irish populated both in Boston and New York City the police department, and so there really are long-standing religious Protestant versus Catholic versus Jewish versus other very, very long-standing religious conflicts that exist in this country, particularly in the East Coast. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, another way that at least the Germans came, but many others as well, was when the businessmen decided that they wanted to bring people to this country because they were going to move things west. They put huge marketing campaigns and told people that they could come here, and they showed them pictures of what it would look like when they got here, and it would always look like where they were from, so they'd feel like they were coming home. Do you remember that, Kathy?
Yes, absolutely.
And then they get here and realize that it wasn't quite exactly, but they were already here.
Right. And at one point, the Germans were the largest ethnic group in the United States. Almost half the population.
Yeah, we actually saw there's a website that does all these interesting different demographic maps of the US, and one of them was about heritage. And I was surprised to see how much of the US is actually German as its primary heritage. Yeah.
And when that stopped, World War I, when that basically we started banning Germans from entering the country and started discriminating against them when we went to war.
Yep. Okay, let me throw one more into the mix. I think the next one is Tidewater, or is the next one Appalachia? Nope, Tidewater. Oh, then the Deep South, then Appalachia. Okay, Tidewater. So Tidewater is really looks like it's a bit of Maryland, western or easternmost Virginia, eastern North Carolina, all along there. I think that's Delaware too. Yeah, so that kind of area. Built by the younger sons of Southern English gentry, it values authority and tradition more than equality or public participation in politics. In the 18th century, it was the most powerful of American nations, but today it is in decline. So yeah, these were all the big land barons, and these were slave. I guess those would have been slave states. Yes,
It's
slave owners.
always been fundamentally conservative
Mhm.
region.
Yeah,
Yeah,
They
those are,
place high value on authority and tradition.
yeah, think Charleston,
yeah.
think that kind of culture. Yeah,
So you
that's
needed to be part of the aristocracy because if
yeah.
you weren't part of them, then you were just a nobody.
Like Thomas Jefferson,
Yep.
yeah.
Yep. And so these were kind of more of a conquering sort of a mindset. One group superior to all others. And so that kind of came along to be. And now, okay, Linda and I lived in Charlotte for a good long while. Joseph, feel free to unmute and say whatever you'd care to say. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no, no,
I just
no.
couldn't
This is
help
your call.
myself.
Yeah.
Are you talking about nations that still exist, or is it in the history?
It is in the
this,
history, and the belief put forth by this book is that there are many, many aspects of this history that continue to impact life in the United States today.
In
well,
very strong ways.
Very strong ways.
but
Very.
are they seen still as nations, or is it not
No,
like that?
no, they would
Like
not be
influences?
referred to as, they would not be referred to as
Mhm.
nations. In fact, that's what made this book such an interesting look anthropologically. Well, I mean, Kathy's an anthropologist, so she can tell you, because it really is just talking about how wherever people come from, they take with them wherever they go.
Yeah.
And so they have a tendency to recreate what they are, what their belief system is, no matter where they travel. And yeah, it's going to start to get blended a little bit over time, and maybe it gets softened a little bit over time. But pretty much, we are where we came from.
Yeah.
And we
Okay.
can see that very clearly. If you travel around the United States, you're going to pick up on certain things. So
Yeah.
Kathy, you're our resident
Yeah.
anthropologist.
I mean, think of them as cultural nations, not political nations, or formal
Mhm.
nations, but cultural nations that have this. I mean, they're heavily infiltrated by, a range of things now, but if you look at the core settlers and the general value systems that exist in those parts, they reflect these things,
Yep,
these
yep.
trends.
And are they referred to as such?
No,
Do people still say, "Well, you're typically a tidewater," or?
no, 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 no. Well, that area is referred to as tidewater because that's what happens there. That's where the tides come into all those little nooks and crannies in the coastline
Yeah.
and all that. So they might use the word tidewater there, but not to represent their
Mm.
culture or their people. More just geographically, that's where the tidewaters have
But
probably a big
some of
expression.
these names still apply. Some of
Yeah.
these names, Appalachia, some of the other new,
Oh
the
yeah, and people are going
Yankee,
to call Yankees. Yeah, you're from okay. I was born in Michigan. I'll promise you, they'll call me a Yankee.
yeah,
But my family is from Appalachia, and they would refer to my family as hillbillies.
that's right. That's right.
So, although
But
technically briar hoppers.
but Joseph, if you think about some of the different cultural areas in some of the European countries, if you look at parts of Germany or parts of Italy, which are very heavily demarcated, some others, there are just some cultural traits where people recognize one another who have those same, they connect with each other
Yep.
for those traits.
Cultural nations.
Yeah, they're
Yeah.
cultural. exactly.
Like I think mentioned last time around, Linda and I lived in Charlotte, North Carolina for 15 years plus. And we can tell you the most difficult thing to find in Charlotte is a native Charlottean. So many people have come from everywhere else because of what Charlotte had to offer. Um, and it's extremely difficult to make friends with a native Charlottean. So they know each other and they detect one another and they have a very different way of interacting with one another. And you know, that's been that way for what? Hundreds of years.
What's fascinating, just a little story, what's fascinating about Tidewater is that I went to, when I was in graduate school, I was at Duke in graduate school, and there was a fellow there who I used to travel with when I traveled home. We'd travel up through Virginia, up through the Carolinas, and his family came from the Charleston area, and that area, and there literally is a totally different dialect
Yep.
of Southern English that is very British aristocracy. I mean, it's a if you could research it and go on the web and look at I think it's the Charleston and the surrounding dialect of Southern speech, it is purely English aristocracy
Yes.
influenced. It's fascinating to listen to.
It really is. And, you know, again, we don't need to travel clear across the country to detect these differences. So, as I said, Lynn and I lived in Charlotte. Well, Charlotte, I don't know if you see this little dot right there that I'm kind of pointing to, but pretty much that's Charlotte. Um, and so here we have North Carolina, half of which is Tidewater and half of which is Appalachia. And I can tell you that you continue to experience that difference today. If you're on the eastern part of North Carolina, where you've got all the universities and you've got all of that Southern Belle kind of culture sorts of stuff going on, compared to the western part of North Carolina, which is up in the Appalachian Mountains and has a whole history about bluegrass and all that sort of thing. These might as well be two very, very different cultures. And pretty much right along Charlotte is where it starts to change. So,
Yeah.
look, same thing in Virginia. The people are in the western part of Virginia, culturally very, very different than this eastern part. And Joseph, for your benefit, it's the Appalachian is a mountain range, and the mountain range starts up here in New England area, not quite that far up, but New York
Yeah,
probably.
yeah, absolutely. Appalachian Trail is in New
Yeah, it
England.
starts up here and it goes all the way down a bit diagonally, all the way down, 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 down to the coast. And so this is a mountain range, and some of the poorest states in the entire country are right along that area. So West Virginia, Kentucky, parts of Tennessee, parts of the Carolinas, there's a lot of poverty here. And long, long, long ago, the way they would make their money, that was what there's 3 M's. They made their money first with moonshine. Moonshine was bootlegged alcohol. Then, when that was no longer prohibited or there's no prohibition anymore, they moved to marijuana. And now it's methamphetamine. So those are the 3 M's: moonshine, marijuana, methamphetamine. And as
What?
you travel through, yeah,
Yeah.
It sounds like
It's,
we do now in the Netherlands.
is that
yeah.
so? Was there originally? Yeah, yeah, because for a
It's
while,
a little bit poorer.
Marijuana and ecstasy.
yeah,
It's
there
a
you go.
little bit poorer though, Joseph. It's not quite the same feel. These are the Blue Ridge Mountains as well.
Yeah, we come down here now. We start getting into both the Appalachia and the Blue Ridge Mountains.
A great movie that I tell people about that really reflects the feel of this culture, of that part of this culture, is Winter's Bone.
Mm-hmm.
And it was Jennifer, what's her name? Can't remember her last name.
Garner.
No, not Garner, the one who was in Hunger Games. Um,
Oh, mhm.
yeah, it was her first movie. And it is an extraordinary film, very dark, but really extraordinary film depicting life among, the northern part of Appalachia and what it's like to live in a meth environment.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
Winter's Bone?
Winter's Bone. I highly recommend you see that film. It's just extraordinary.
Yeah, but Jennifer Lawrence.
Jennifer Lawrence, thank you.
Jennifer Lawrence, yeah. Yeah, and for a TV series, if you could get Justified, it's on Netflix. You'll learn a whole lot about that area of the country. But point is,
In
lots
fact,
of
it was
poverty.
that where T grew up.
Yeah, my family is from, I come from Appalachia. And
Wow.
so and what it describes for Appalachia, founders came from war-ravaged Ireland, England, and the Scottish lowlands. If you're from this area of the country, you definitely have Irish blood or English blood, whatever. You've got your Scotch Irish,
Yeah.
big deal there. Bringing a culture forged by near constant danger and upheaval, values individual liberty, and is suspicious of aristocrats, social engineers. Nobody here likes the government in this whole area. I promise you, these people are not fond of any authority being directed over any of them. That's its history. That's it today. There'll be some pockets of exceptions. So for example, this is the state of Kentucky, and there are 3 different Kentuckys. So the 3 different Kentuckys are based on what its primary output is. So there is horse Kentucky, tobacco Kentucky, and coal Kentucky. So
Where
horse
chicken Kentucky.
there's no Kentucky Fried Chicken. I don't even think started in Kentucky. I don't remember where it started, but Kentucky Fried Chicken. People in Kentucky can definitely make some fried chicken. But the horse one, those are very wealthy people in Kentucky. And then the tobacco was the major crop, and so that was kind of like the middle. But the coal mines that were in the Appalachian Mountains, that's where all the poverty really is. And
Oh,
my
that's
family
where,
happens to be from
yeah.
Coal, Kentucky. My family were coal miners.
Yeah, that's a tough life. That
It's
is
a
very.
very tough life. Yeah. But it explains a lot. It explains a whole lot. But I'll tell you right now, there is no surprise that this particular area of the country loves its guns, hates its government. Um, you know, definitely loves its soldiers because probably they supply their kids end up moving into the military because there's not much else that people from that area can really do anymore. So to this day, it's still very oppressed. And yeah, with
Well, it's- I sort of connect with what you said about this area because it sounds like the area I came from here in Holland, in Groningen.
yeah,
Yeah, it's like it's not it's quite similar.
yeah.
So
Well,
they
I
are
think yeah, you can find that because there's some area, no matter where you go, there's going to be people who've got all the money.
yeah,
And there's going to be people who are working as hard as they possibly can and struggling to make ends meet.
yeah.
And so I think that's going to be true wherever we go. And you wonder, how did that come to be? Which of these nations kind of lead to that mindset? But it's interesting if you look at something like the Civil War. So most would say that it was the Yankees against the Deep South. And maybe Tidewater because of the whole thing about slavery and all that. Meanwhile, you got these people in Appalachia just kind of going like, as long as you're not messing with my individual personal freedoms, leave me out of this.
Mhm.
Leave me out of this, and all that. So yeah. So, okay, well, that's our time for today. If you guys are finding this interesting, we'll finish it up on Thursday. But again, while I find this very interesting from an anthropological and a historical perspective, I'm very interested about the tension that's driving it because the issues around which one particular area has greater tension could be very different than other areas.
Very different.
And if we can understand these differences in tension, but what people are paying attention to, it might be easier to find common ground. It might be easier to understand,
Yeah.
what it's all
Well, that's
about.
a really interesting approach. I see where you're going to with the where you're going to with that.
Yeah. Well, I
It's
hope
like
it
internal
also,
tension, right?
yeah, well, exactly right. And I hope that, obviously, we have lots of people who listen to our calls that are from other countries that don't really know all that much about the United States, but hopefully this is helping them understand that the United States is a vast amount of land. And so there's no way you can have everyone be like the same. It's almost like we've got all these different, I mean, each state could easily be described in its own unique cultural ways. And inside of a given state, you could find multiple sufficient cultural distinctions that you might go, well, they're from the North. Like even in Michigan, Lynn and I can tell you there's a big difference between people who are in the thumb or below, because the Michigan looks like a big mitten, and a big difference between the lower peninsula and the upper peninsula population. So, yeah.
I appreciate you're doing this, T, because it is one of my favorite books, as Linda knows. We've talked about this before,
Yeah.
and I think it's just such an important, it's an eye opener, opens the door to so many different conversations. So
Well, I think
thank
it does. And like one of the things that I put on my list, we'll talk about it on Thursday, is, you know, there's this belief around the world that everybody in the United States has one, if not more, semi-automatic for fully automatic weapons. And the truth is, the vast majority of the citizens of the United States don't own a weapon, and more than half of the citizens of the United States have never fired a weapon.
Yeah.
So, but when you start looking at this map, you could probably predict where you're more likely to find individuals with their own firearms.
Multiple firearms. Yeah.
And for different reasons. If you're out here, what do they call this area over here, Linda?
Where that's where all that's the far west. That's where all the ranchers and the cowboys are.
Yeah, but because there are animals here that can kill you. And so it's a long way away. We got to deal with bears, and you got to deal with mountain lions, and you got to deal with all kinds of things. So there's a difference between owning a weapon for hunting purposes or for protection against you know, a threat of an animal or something like that, and people that are over here in you know, New York City or down here, you know, these are the motivation for having weapons
The
can be
tension
very, very
there is
different. The
different.
tension is very different. So yeah, there you go. Yep. Okay. All right. Great talking to you guys. We will pick up where we left off on Thursday. So bye for now, everyone. Take
See you
care.
Thursday.
All right. Bye.
Bye.